Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining Getting Real 2022. This session is focusing on issues in archival documentary. My name is Stephanie Owens, and I'll be moderating today's session. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a Black woman with curly brown hair sitting in front of an imposing plant and mostly Black canvas behind me. I'm really excited to be in conversation with our panelists. We have Veronika Kusumaryati, Ernst, Karel, and Agustina Comedi. We have such a rich conversation ahead of us with increased interest and attention on how we work with archival materials. There's plenty to talk about. What is our responsibility to the people whose recordings we're using? What might the future hold for how we access archival materials? How are attitudes evolving around working with, building new, and working against archives? So I'm really excited to see where the conversation goes. To start, I would love to have everyone introduce themselves, talk a little bit about your practice and maybe the films that we're going to be talking about in today's discussion. Agustina, could you start?
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Agustina Comedi. I'm an Argentinian director and screenwriter. My pronouns are she, are she. I'm sitting with the thing below me. It's like a white wall. It looks kind of pink, but it's white. That's because of the light. And well, I'm very happy to be here. I'm very interested about this conversation. And well, I've done 2 films. I directed 2 films. I have many works as a screenwriter, but I will talk about those 2 films before that. And they are Silence is a Falling Body. It's a film from 2017. When I was 12, my father died on an accident, and after a couple of years, I discovered he had like hundreds of hours of VHS tapes, and I had many like uncertainties about his past. So through those tapes and meeting his friends, I discovered he was like twice clandestine. He was a political activist, but he was also a homosexual man, and that was out of the narrations of my family. So that was a secret. And Silence is a Falling Body. It's about that process of finding out this other version of the story, of the family story. And after that, Playback came. That it's a short film. When I was shooting Silence is a Falling Body, I met La Delpi. That was my father's last couple before he met my mother. And she showed me her archives. She used to record every performance they had with Calas group. That was a group of transsexuals and drag queens that performed during the 80s in Argentina. And it was a very rich process in which we watched those archives, and she told me the stories of every people that participated on Calas performances. And I think that it was like a kind of friendship manifesto towards her friends, because most of them are dead now because of police persecution and because of the AIDS crisis. Yeah, that's it.
Veronika, could you go next?
Hi everyone, my name is Veronika Kusumaryati. I'm an anthropologist and artist from Indonesia. So I have black hair, oval face, and slightly fancy glasses. I'm very happy to be here. I work with Ernst Karel to compose expedition content. So it's a feature-length documentary using the archive of Michael Rockefeller, the fourth generation member of the Rockefeller family in the US who traveled to West Papua. Is an area in the easternmost part of Indonesia or in the Pacific in 1961. I think Ernst will continue introducing the piece after
Okay.
this.
My name
Thank
is Ernst Karel, and I'm very happy to be here also, and thank you to everyone. And I'm a white man sitting against one wall of my sound studio, and so there's absorptive paneling, acoustic absorptive paneling just here to my right side, and some bookshelves and miscellaneous equipment kind of piled up behind me in the distance. And collaborated with Veronika on expedition content, which we call a augmented sound work. I mean, it's has the form of a film. It functions as a film. It was composed for the cinema as a sound work, but we also decided to use the projector that a cinema affords, and not just the left, center, right speakers, which we had originally intended the piece to be focused on. And it's composed exclusively from these archival tapes from this very specific historical event that we'll talk more about, and which was important, not only in the trajectory of, in a number of different kind of simultaneous trajectories coming together. The history of West Papua and its ongoing struggle for independence. History of visual anthropology is another kind of lens you could look at it through. It was an important, the expedition was organized by the ethnographic filmmaker Robert Gardner, and it produced a film called Dead Birds, which is a landmark film in so-called visual anthropology. And it was a colonial endeavor that we'll also talk about. So it's a history, and it's part of the history of West Papua, but of the kind of this kind of colonial expedition in general. Let's see. So other work that I've done that's kind of related to today's topic in terms of the archive. One current project is a new, also sound work having to do with the 1972 presidential election and the nightmarish 1973 re-inauguration of President Richard Nixon, which is a sound, and that project involves a sound archive of recordings by a team led by a kind of sound designer, inventor, sound recordist named Dan Dugan here in the San Francisco area, where he got a group of people to all go out to the event I want to focus on is the inauguration day, and he got a team of recordists to go out to all the different parks where all these different huge protest events were happening to protest Richard Nixon's re-inauguration. And just fascinating interactions, perspectives, being recorded from multiple perspectives. And so I'm interested to see, like with expedition content, how far we can go with audio only in that project. And then in some previous collaborations with, for example, with a filmmaker, Luke Fowler, working on archival subjects, for example, the queer Montreal, Vancouver-based composer Martin Bartlett, a portrait of Martin Bartlett, really working through his archives. And actually just a couple weeks ago, I finished another portrait that Luke did of the filmmaker Margaret Tate, Scottish filmmaker, going through her archives. And so also being able to work with these kinds of British and Scottish film archives from the 70s. I've probably said too much, so let's...
No, that's great. This is Stephanie speaking. I think between all of you, you have such experience working with archival materials, I figured maybe we could start first talking about access, because Veronika and Ernst, you're dealing with institutionally held archives. Agustina, you're dealing with personal ones. And so I think both of them have their own challenges and ways of working with. So I'm wondering if we could first start with Veronika and Ernst, if you could talk a little bit about how you had access to these Rockefeller like audio tapes. Was it challenging to get access, and what that whole process was like?
Mm-hmm. Maybe I'll start with that one. This is Ernst, and I just volunteered to start because we got access in a slightly indirect sort of side door way. And it has to do with where we were situated at the time. So at the time, this is when we first got access, was 2015, had a half-time job as assistant director of the Film Study Center at Harvard, which had been founded by the filmmaker Robert Gardner and personally endowed by his millions in the 70s. And so my salary was kind of being paid, by Robert Gardner. He had died a year earlier. He was no longer around. I never worked with Robert Gardner. He left before I got there. But a year after he died, an assistant working with his estate approached me, because I do sound work, and they knew that, and said that they were finishing up a project which is itself archival in a way. The short films that they were wanting to make, that was an ongoing project that Gardner worked on while he was alive, from that material of the so-called Harvard Peabody expedition to Netherlands, New Guinea in 1961. And so they were finishing up these short films with an editor, and would I be interested in making some soundtracks for these films? And to do so, here's this whole archive. And I had no idea the archive existed. And Gardner sort of had this kind of arrangement, you could say, with the Peabody Museum, where they kind of like just used it as a personal storage space in a way. Gardner did, even long after he was gone. And so they kind of would just go in and out. And it seemed like his assistant had just kind of gone in, copied all of the archive off of CDs, which was the format it was on at that time. This is the audio recordings, and just gave it to me in the form of a hard drive. So I don't think any permissions were asked or anything like that at that time. We did later, of course, get permission to use it for the film. But so that whole project happened where I first listened through to the archive with an ear toward how can I use this for these films, and then of course immediately brought Veronika into the project because that's her area of special expertise, and I knew she would be great to work with on this. So not really an orthodox process of getting access to this archive in this case.
And Veronika, when you came onto the project, what struck you the most from what you were listening to?
So this is Veronika speaking. Thank you for the questions. I think the first thing that struck me is the fact that it's recorded by the Harvard Peabody expedition to Netherlands, New Guinea. So that's the official name of the expedition in 1961. And from what I listened, of course, there are so many like familiar conversation atmospheres that I encounter in West Papua. So I've been working in the area since 2011. No, 2012. So 2012. So and I have met our collaborator actually, Cornelia, and Cornelia even before this project. So this project also involved our Papuan collaborators. They are from the Dani, or like the Hubula ethnic group, which is the ethnic group that the expedition recorded in 1961 in the form of film, in the form of sound, in the form of photography. So the expedition really produced like a whole range of archive. But we just, encountered this audio archive in 2015, precisely because Michael Rockefeller disappeared in West Papua. So the tape were actually maintained by the family, the Rockefeller family, and the Rockefeller family just donated to the Peabody Museum in 2005, and then the archive was transferred to Indiana Archive of Traditional Music. So they digitized that. So that's the whole configuration of the archive itself, and it's really about how familiar like the recording is, but also like it's also a question about like why they record this, right? And this is a question that also struck Cornelis, our collaborator in West Papua, like why they record this, even though he feels that my God, this is like so impressive because it's from the 60s and we don't have any record about our ancestors, so or descend, our grandfathers, grandmothers. So that's I think the first impression.
And so when you started to then collaborate on what would become expedition content, the augmented film, were you thinking about the materials that came out from the original expedition in the 60s, the film Dead Birds? Like, were you thinking about what you were creating in relation to those other materials?
So this is Veronika speaking. When we compose the work, actually we rely on this two kind of temporalities, which is the past, when the recording was made, but also contemporary situation in which like the hubula, the people whose voice, whose images were being recorded in 1961, like have a different also agenda on the archive. So I think it's really informed us as a composer or maker of this composition. I think precisely because like doing like ethnography of history is really different from like just to accept history as it is. And so I think there is a lot of investigation from our part about what the role of this archive or what the role of this expedition in the 60s, but also today. So I think the that's not very obvious maybe in like technical term, but I think it's really inform us like how we shape the archive. Of course, we think about Dead Bird, and how the film is really relies on images, especially images of black bodies of the hubula. So I think we are very conscious about the materiality of the medium, in a sense that the visual versus audio or sound, images versus like soundscape or whatever like technical term that you use. So it's very it is this composition is like, I think kind of also us trying to navigate like what the work can do in the present situation.
This is Stephanie. Yeah, I think there's a lot more to talk about in regards to the form and materiality. But before we go further, Agustina, I wanted to talk to you about the discovery of your family's tapes and how you discern like what you wanted to include, what you didn't, what it was like maybe working with your family or not working with your family. We can start there and then move on to what the process was like for Playback.
Okay. It's Agustina speaking. Well, I found the material in the top of a wardrobe, so the access was quite easy. But the decision of what to use and what not to use was difficult. For me, there's a big question that had to do with the issues around truth. There was an official version or portrait of the family, and I knew there was another possible portrait. And I understand family as an institution, like the state, like church, like medical system, psychiatry, um, and I wanted to have a conversation with the institution and its ways of building narratives, and uh, and the family album, that it's like the decision of what images will last and which are out of that portrait. So the discussion for me about this matter of truth was not with my family members, but with the institution, like the family institution. Because like I don't think that this whole matter has to do much with like personal decisions, but um, but with this like heteronormative norms or um, laws. So that was like the frontier for me, that settled that decision of what material to use and which not to use. Um, it's a blurry frontier, but it worked for me so as to establish what I would use and what I shouldn't use. And I wanted to speak my version, um, like against this other version, not against, but like I wanted to like build a parallel narrative without making the individuals of my family responsible for that decision. So yeah, that was more or less the way in which I established which images I would use and which ones I wouldn't.
Is there maybe an image in the film that is in the film that you could use as an example of and talk us through like how you decided to include that particular image, just so we can get a better sense of how you sort of engage with like the institution of family?
Yeah, well, maybe I can talk about the ones which I exclude. Like sometimes there were like very strong sayings of one particular member of the family, which in Spanish we say charge the ink, but I don't think that in English that expression works. But that made one of the members like very responsible for a narration that it's in a context, because if you are editing a film, you are choosing certain things that in that context works like in a certain way. So I excluded those images, or I worked with off with offs like sound for that voices, and not use them on like in on, so as not to charge on them the responsibilities. And um, yeah, I guess that's the most accurate thing I can say. I'm not sure it's too accurate, but
No, that's helpful. And salute for whoever. I don't know if that was a sneeze. This is Stephanie speaking. And then for playback, those materials were from someone else. So could you talk a little bit about how navigating that went?
yeah. Well, in playback, we talked a lot. I did many, like, we got together with La Delpi, the protagonist of the film. She was the one, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but she gathered some money from every show so as to pay the camera person to record. Like, I found that very important, because it was like if she had the feeling that those images had to last, like it was worth it, that those images exist. So she showed me that material, and we sat in front of the TV, and she played that once and again. While we were doing that process, La Colo, that it's another member of the group, she was still alive, but she died when I was editing. So they got together and they talked about those images. So I write everything down, and that helped me to create the voiceover that goes all through the film. Yes, and yes, basically that was the process. I always try to stay together with the people with which I'm working with. Like I'm very close, like before, during, and after the process, and I think that that's a way of, like, I don't know, having the sensation if the paths where I'm going through are okay, or like if they are ethical, and if if I'm putting the right questions. That's my personal way of working. Yeah.
What does it look like to continue to engage after the film is made?
Well, for me, it was very, very enriching. Even like with the first film with my family, it was not easy at the beginning because, of course, as it's a secret, there's a lot of energy put on like keeping that secret. It's not easy to talk a secret, but I think that staying close and having the chance to talk about it and to really put this idea of like I'm discussing with I'm arguing with like something that it's bigger than personal decisions, put some light on it, and those resistances were vanished after a while, like because I think that it's nice, or it's good to think who that truth, that univocal and absolute and heteronormative truth benefits. Like I don't think we take any profit on it. So when you are able to talk that, I think that resistance vanishes.
This is Stephanie speaking. And now, were all of the tapes digitized? Like, how do the tapes exist now? Like, do you consider those tapes an archive or a personal archive, or how do you characterize the source material for both of your films?
Yeah, now they are digitalized. In the case of Playback, now they belong to, or they are part of, Trans Archive. That it's a very important archive that it's going through, like that it's building every day here in Argentina. Delphi is in touch with them now, and they have they have that archive. She doesn't lost her property, of course, but it belongs to that archive. And so that was very interesting, because she could, like, her archive could dialogue with other trans people that we consider survivors, because here in Argentina, the life expectancy of a trans person is like 40 years old, 35, 40. So this archive is made up of all the images, pictures of trans people. And yes, regards like Silence is a Falling Body, I think that yes, not mainly not my family images, but probably the testimonies of that are part of an oral archive. I think that maybe makes sense as a queer archive, or an LGTB archive. Yes.
Stephanie speaking. Veronika and Ernst, I wonder if you could talk a bit more about your collaboration with the Hubala people and making the archive, the audio archive, accessible.
Veronika, you want to start?
All right. This is Veronika speaking. So yeah, from the onset of this project, we have been working with our with the Papuan artists, especially Hubula artists. So and this relationship, I think, goes beyond the project itself. I think because I know them like before, and I continue, or we continue establishing this relationship with them. But I think it's different from like the institutional context of the archive. For instance, in the U.S. or in like generally in global North. In West Papua, there is no specific like institution that could maintain the archive itself in West Papua. So they have the anthropological museum at the local university there, and it was also established by the fund of the Rockefeller family. This is also very interesting subject actually. But in 1984, the Indonesian authorities actually arrested uh, the curator of the museum and kill him eventually, but also destroys the archive. So I think for the Papuan, it is very important to maintain the archive outside West Papua or Indonesia, because in if it exists in Indonesia, it will be destroyed. So, or there is just like neglect. Um, because there is a very strong, sense of discrimination against Papuan, that the Papuan do not have culture, that they don't have past, things like that. So I think it's very interesting, like to work with them to decide like what's the best way to continue working with this. And I think it's also there's an asymmetrical power relation between, of course, us, scholar or artists in the US, for instance, versus our Papuan friends in West Papua, precisely because they don't have this like institutional support. So I think what we are trying to do is like to talk with as many as we can in West Papua, and to determine like the best approach to do this. I think because the thing that they demand from the expedition or from Harvard Peabody Museum is a new form of reparation. So it's not a reparation that or restitution like in the case of so many museums in the West. It's like to return the artifact. I think that's not the case in West Papua. So they want a different kind of relationship that kind of repair the relationship that was very imperialistic or very colonial in the past. And it's not easy. I think everybody's navigating this.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, this is Ernst. I mean, of course, yeah, obviously the tapes are one thing, and we don't even know where the tapes themselves are, if those are sitting in Indiana or if those are in the Peabody. But the digital archive, and here we're talking about the whole body of recordings, not just the ones not just what we made into this film, but the digital archive should be. I mean, I think that's the project to make that fully available online. So that it's not something that can be destroyed by the Indonesian military government. But yeah, yeah.
This is Stephanie. So right now, what's the progress on that, or what are the challenges of doing that, making it available online?
Well, one aspect is that the Peabody Museum won't go through us, so they want to deal institution to institution with an institution in West Papua, and I'm not sure actually where that is right now. But I think one thing we could work on further with the Peabody is is simply making them available online in general, so that they would also be available from anyone in West Papua, but just to kind of help make the whole archive listenable online, with notes. And we've obviously done a lot of work, and Veronika's done a lot of work with Cornelis Siep and Nicholas Lokabal to translate a lot of the recordings. It would be amazing to continue to cross-reference those with notes from Karel Heider, the anthropologist who was along. But anyway.
This is Stephanie speaking. I mean, and this might be a question that maybe we return to, but I feel like, this question of access is a big one when working with archives and archival materials. And I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on what the future holds. Like if we fast forward time travel, like 50 years from now, what things might change, or is there a way to preserve while also giving power to communities? Is it about working together? Or I'm just curious what y'all's thoughts are, given that you've each been working with archival materials in different ways.
Maybe I can start. So this is Veronika speaking. I think the question of access is very important, and to make archive available for public, especially in those who are in the recording or in the archive, is very important. But I think the task for institution or archival, the guardian of the archive, whoever they are, is not limited to the access, because access alone doesn't guarantee like the equality, like in terms of like knowledge production or affect or other things. So I think in our case, Harvard Peabody Museum has made the record accessible in the sense that you can go to the catalog, online catalog, and like see what is in there. But I think it doesn't make any sense for the Papuan now, like just to see it, like it has to be a relationship between this institution with the object itself, and with the people who were or who are recorded in the archive. So I think that's why I think it's not only question about the past, like how we treat the past, but also about the future orientation, like what we want to do with this archive, or do we want to produce a new knowledge? Do we want to, like remove our guilt from the past crime that we might have done? So this is, I think, it's a very complex question for us as a kind of facilitator. So I consider myself as an artist, also as a facilitator, because we deal with so many like different institutional arrangement. And I think it's, I applaud archive that make the archive open or accessible, but I think it's not enough. We have to do more, which is to establish this relationship through an object. So it's kind of like become more like a reciprocal or more slightly fair relationship between those who have power to archive and those who are in the archive or who are recorded in the archive.
It's Agustina speaking. I fully agree with Veronika. I just wanted to mention this trans archive I mentioned before. I think that it's a great expression because they've done, first because it's a group of trans people which are organizing and gathering all that material, but also they did something that I think it's great, that is they have these conversations with different facilitators that so as to generate a discussion around that archive and different ways of letting that archive circulate in different ways and to settle a dialogue with the community. So, for example, they asked me to work on a TV series that it's in the public TV. So we worked together for that series, and that was just one of very different expressions of that circulation. And I find that's great because it's not just a matter of access, but also how that conversation reaches the community.
Yeah, this is Ernst. I mean, that seems like a kind of ideal setup for an archive, where the archive is actually being accumulated by the people for whom it's important and people who are involved in its creation, and it becomes a kind of collaboration and a kind of cooperative thing. That sounds, I mean, obviously that's a completely different situation from what our situation was, where it was obviously just people going in, I mean, creating the archive, but yeah, no bottom up participation at all. I mean, none of the texts that, I mean, not just these sound recordings, the film, the photographs, all of the texts that anthropologist Karl Haider wrote about the Hubala people, none of it was ever, that we know of, certainly was never translated, but it's never brought back, never shown to anyone there. It was a pretty extreme situation.
Yeah, I just want to add this, Veronika speaking. I think what we did actually like to present the film in the film festival there in West Papua. So it's we met young filmmakers from the region, and I think it generated so many conversation about how these young people might be able to also make use of the archives that are abroad, not in the region. So I think digital technology has really helped with that kind of facilitation, and we are grateful for that. Like for instance, for the screening, for also make the archive available for them. So, but of course, this is not enough because we have to like really establish the connection with the people. It's a connection. So I think that's the term institution is a bit alienating, precisely because it's really sometimes it's really remove like the intimacy, like the affect that are associated. That's yeah, associated with this object. I think for museum is just an archive, but for this community it's like it's recording of their grandfathers, grandmothers, right? So it's really meaningful, like to not only to talk about this access but also to talk about relationship, I think.
This is Stephanie speaking. I wonder, Veronika and Ernst, if you could talk a little bit about how what you just spoke about, Veronika, about how these are recordings of their grandfathers or grandmothers, whereas like for an institution, it's like an archive, a kind of a colonial archive. And in your project, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you held those two things and how it shaped the form, which I just think is so provocative for anyone who hasn't seen expedition content yet. I'm excited for you to see it, but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how you decided to make it a primarily audio forward piece.
So there's a couple of different questions there. Why audio forward, and then kind of balancing both the sense of working through the archive and the fact that these are the voices of people's grandmothers and grandfathers. The audio only part had to do with the pretty simple idea of really wanting to just listen to these tapes. I mean, these tapes existed on their own. Obviously, it is in relation, you know, you mentioned earlier, and I mentioned probably all of us mentioned the film Dead Birds. So it is in relationship to that, just, because it has to be. Because primary reason that sound recordings were being made was because Gardner was making that film and needed the sound. Of course, because they couldn't record film and audio at the same time, given how loud the camera was, the practice of the audio recordist, Michael Rockefeller, is very different from the normal process of simply recording sound for a film. And that, so he's like in a way self-consciously generating an archive with categories, you know, that he announces at the beginning of the different tapes, you know, occupational sounds, sounds of nature, et cetera, et cetera. And in a way, because, you know, the expedition just proliferated images, we both found that listening to people's voices without seeing their image, really, and listening, you know, for me, to a language that I don't understand, but hearing conversation, hearing relationality, hearing tone of voice, all of that stuff, I'm listening much differently, and without kind of some of the preconceptions I might have if I'm also seeing an image of what's going on at that time. And yeah, so part of it was simply wanting to, and I think we listen more deeply to all the details in a sound recording. You know, if there's an image happening at the same time, then we sort of hear the audio as going along with the image. Just that's kind of how it works, how our minds work. We're hearing this audio that goes with the image. But if there's no image, we'll hear a lot of stuff in that audio that might not have been brought to the fore by the image, if you see what I mean. So we're interested in that. That whole phenomenon, for one thing, and to allow the kind of, and then getting a little bit maybe towards the other part of your question, to allow the kinds of voices to come forward that weren't included in Dead Birds. I mean, almost nobody's voice other than Robert Gardner's was included in Dead Birds. But, you know, to allow women singing, or, you know, children singing or speaking, and incidental moments where nothing much was going on, just sheer relationality. And of course, a lot of the piece focuses on those moments of relationship with the members of the expedition themselves. That's how I'd start to answer that.
This is Stephanie. Veronika, did you have anything to add? Just wanted to make sure before. Okay. Agustina, I wonder if we could talk also a little bit about the hybrid nature of playback and performance. And first, you can just elaborate a little bit on the sort of decision-making process, and then we can talk, you know, dive a little bit deeper into what the implications are of like performance with archives.
Okay, yeah. Well, as it's Agustina speaking. As I said before, like there was something about the nature of how that relationship with Nadelpi started, and how we watched together her archives, and also how he and Lacolo. I need to do something. Just a second, because my dog is here. I need to open the door. Sorry.
Well, we're gonna need to see your dog.
Yeah.
Now.
There. Zoom is like this, you know, life enters. Well, as I was saying, they had these conversations in which they changed all the time the anecdotes. Like they were talking about all the members that were there, that most of them were dead already when we were watching the tapes, and they changed the story about each of them every time we watch. So this question about truth came again to me, and the place of fantasy, and the importance of fantasy. And I felt that was very powerful, because this hegemonic idea of truth is something that it's built by cis-sexual, white, Occidental people. So for them, fantasy was a whole way of of surviving and imagining like futures they weren't available to have because they were imprisoned or they were not cared by the health system. They were not, accepted by health system, and this hybrid nature of playback has to do with that. Like, there's a small fiction inside the film in which they practice or they say different like possible futures for those friends that are no longer there. So it's a kind of uchrony, it's a like, yeah. um, and there's a right relationship with that exercise and playback, because there's playback, I'm meaning lip sync.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about like the untruthfulness of lip sync. Like, uh, they say it's not true, because it's not your voice, but you are like speaking, like moving your mouth on top of someone else's voice. And uh, I think that in a way that fantasy of embodying like big singers, like famous singers, and inhabiting the fantasy of another one's voice, that it's a very powerful gesture of resistance. And also I think that we can't like think about Liza Minnelli with all the performances of these trans women that for years have done Liza Minnelli's songs. So yeah, there's something there about breaking the linear idea of time, and the linear idea of truth, um, that was like what we were thinking with the movie.
Stephanie speaking. I mean, I think, you bringing up breaking like the linear idea of time, I think is really interesting to me. And I think for me, I feel that in all of the films that you've created. And Veronika and Ernst, I wonder if that's a link for you, if that resonates for you, this idea of a collapsed or intersection of time in expedition content, or is that something that you're interested in?
I'm curious if Veronika has an answer. I do, but I'll follow you.
Okay, let me think. This is Veronika speaking. Time. Actually, the archive is organized by date. So, and Mike Rockefeller had been very reliable on that. Like, like in every recording, he always like mention like the date of, the chronology, like where it is, like when it is. But the way we compose that actually is was we didn't follow that chronology, or we didn't follow the archive chronology. And I think because, yeah, I think we are an artist. I don't like, in a sense that it doesn't make sense, if we follow the chronology of the archive. Like, we try to make some sort of argument, sonic argument, through this narrative arc. So, of course, we borrow a lot from conventional like filmmaking language, like establishing shot, or we need to introduce the place, or we need to introduce the characters. Uh, but I think what we are aiming for is not some sort of like, like linear history about Michael encounters with the Hubula. Um, so it's really a project that is framed around the question of of this exposition itself. So it's, of course, so it's not only about what is in the archive, but also what is outside the archive that that the archive actually doesn't address. So I think it's very important also to reflect on that on our part, and like I think from conventional history making that the expedition has made, um, there is no disruption. So there is a smooth representation about what the expedition was trying to do, right? But of course we saw racism, we saw sexism, we saw so many things that outside or inside the archive itself, like so we can read against the grain, but also outside the archive. So I think we intervene in that sense.
Yeah, and this is Ernst, and in that, and by extension, the things that were sort of accidentally included in the archive that weren't part of the project, like the whole kind of party sequence that happens near the end of the piece, and or even the conversation that opens it, the sort of photography lesson that opens the piece, was left over on a tape that had been recorded over, and at the end of that tape, suddenly there's this backwards speech, and the archivist flipped that over and recorded it, and it was this photography lesson, which was just a practice kind of recording session. But in terms of time, so yeah, the piece does allow us to get outside of a linear time. But I think I would think that probably most people working with archives, part of the pleasure of working with older materials, part of the pleasure of actually working with it is the materiality of the stuff itself, the tape, the VHS tape in Agustina's case, which she explores so beautifully in the films. And in our case, like the fact that the tape, when the tape is running, it's recording, yes, some sounds maybe, but more to the point, just duration, just simple time passing at a certain speed. And so we kind of point that out in a couple of places in our piece where, one point where Michael says, the first take didn't work because the recording head was not against, the tape was not against the recording head. And there's actually a blank space that he explains will happen. And we just let that blank space happen. And that's just this kind of like mysterious transposition of a duration from one time into this present moment. So we experience the exact same duration, but without its sort of reference. So it's playing with time also in that way, but just in terms of the medium itself.
This is Stephanie speaking. And I think both the expedition content and your films, Agustina, I think there's nods to the making of, like the production of the materials. So I feel like an expedition content, like the sound of the mic, or just him labeling things or not labeling things, is part of the film. And then even Agustina, when we'll see like the tracking of the VHS and a pause, but then the audio continues to go on, which, I mean, I love all of I love those traits about the work. I think it's just really a creative read of the archive and of archival materials. But I wanted to spend a little bit more time on what's not in archives, because I think that's has become a big part of discussions of late. And so, Agustina, I know you're working on a new project that's dealing with police archives, and so I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about this idea of what's not present as you're working with that archive.
Yeah, it's Agustina speaking. Yes, I'm working on a new film. It doesn't have title yet, but it's about sex workers. I'm doing a lab since like for 6 years now in an organized group of sex workers. They function as a how do you say sindicato, labor union? No,
yeah.
Yeah.
Labor union.
It's not actually a labor union because sex work is not legalized here, but they try to work as one. And there's no, like, it's very difficult to find archives which are not police archives. And there's a huge police archive from the beginning of the 20th century that it's spread all over the like small towns in the municipality of each town. And those archives are, some of them are very badly conserved. The photographs are teared apart, and they also have signs of violence, like people write things in, like, over the pictures or over the comments. And also one of the issues is that, of course, like the violence of a police record, and the absence of this organized or this community like functioning. So at the beginning, it was very difficult for me to deal with that archive because of, like, the question was how not to reproduce this police violence. And well, I'm working on them re yeah rebuilding and understanding and thinking about those images, because I find that when they read those images, there's something that is restored that you can't find in the archives. It's that their own practices of resistance, of community, their point of view, yeah.
So this is Stephanie speaking. So I mean, I know that you're just, the project, you're working on the project. So do you see it as a film, and then also will you be creating a film and then also working to build a new archive or add to that archive, or is it simultaneous kind of projects happening, or how do you envision?
Yes. We got some money. It's Agustina speaking. We got some money, small money, but we are traveling through these small towns and digitalizing this archive, and we are finding the ways to, yes, to make those images to work in the way we want to, and not in a, like, yes, because this archive will belong to the group, to the community of sex workers. Like, we are trying to restore it because we feel that that's the safe place for those images to be, not the police records, not us, like, not us without them, like people who are making films without the community of sex workers. And we are, for the film, we are also, like, trying to confront that archive to their own archives. Like, there are some objects, there are some personal pictures, and we are also working with their bodies as part of that archive, like part of the sex workers archive, because they have a lot to say about that, like the marks of, like, that had to do with the police violence, and yes, all the how but by their own words, by their own views and their own memories, they resignificate their bodies, and not by a word that speak about their bodies, because there's a lot of that around sex work, like people speaking about their bodies, or people giving meaning to their body without their lecture about it.
Stephanie speaking, is what does this community holding on to their own archive look like? Is it digital? Is there a physical component where within their community there's a place where they can collectively have access to some of these objects that you're talking about? I'm just curious as to what that looks like, because maybe it's encouraging for others to help, facilitate or.
It's Agustina speaking. Now that's very difficult because they are always struggling with space. They don't have a fixed space. Sometimes they do have a building, but sometimes they don't. So that's quite difficult. So yeah, we found out that digitalizing it's like the safest way of keeping it. It's the only possible way, unless they get some money for having a person doing that, having the material conditions to keep that archive. So for now, it's trying to organize in a digital way.
Stephanie speaking, and of course, I'm sure there's its own issues with digitization, as it has its own set of issues that we'll have to collectively, figure out and work through. But we don't have a ton of time left, and I want to make sure that we're able to touch upon anything that you all want to talk about. I mean, is there something that's really exciting you right now in the fields with documentary and archival work? Is there something that you're hopeful for? You want to put out a call to a challenge of anything?
I mean, in a way, for me, it's an interesting way to work, simply because there's so much that already exists. Like as a maker, as a audio, whatever, a maker of any kind. Like, do we really need to make more stuff? Or if we are going to do so, maybe a useful way to do it is to actually like try to figure out where we are as to, in relationship to where we've come. Like, that's kind of looking back at material that already exists is for me, an exciting and productive way to work. Just on that level.
Read instead of glance.
This is Stephanie. Veronika or Agustina, do you have any thoughts?
It's Agustina speaking. I think that, well, we mentioned it before, but the way of archives, like the way they circulate and dialogue with the communities, for me, it's the most like important thing to think about. Like, yes, how these communities can make it like appropriate that archives that actually belong to them and circulate it and give meaning to it. And that's a difficult thing to deal with in this context, in which, at least in Latin America, where I live and where I come from, yes, the culture has very little support and culture thought, for not like in a mainstream way, but in these other ways, it's even more difficult.
I would like to add, this is Veronika. I think for me, the idea of translation is really like speak to like this conversation, and many Papuan friends actually push for more work or resources invested on the translation from the context of 1961, when the recording was made, to the present situation, including the linguistic translation or language translation. I think because the young generation today no longer speak the language that their grandmothers or grandfathers spoke in the 60s. So I think it's very, I think it's very heavy task. Because of if you put it on individual, it's very hard. Like you don't have resources, you don't have time, maybe, or like in the case of me, I don't have like enough resources or time. So we have to constantly struggle like how to do this work. But I think it's very important. And then I think what we are doing right now is like to communicate the type of sound uh, that were recorded in Michael Rockefeller archive, but then interpreted by the Hubula anthropologist himself. So it's trying to, maybe we plan to make a compilation, it's kind of like anthology or CDs of music, because that's also an important archive in itself, like the music of these people and the expression that they have in the 60s. So that's one thing. The second is like the translation of so many anthropological work about their communities. So this is something that we didn't and do not invest much, which is to translate our anthropological knowledge that we gain from the communities. So this is something that I think is a priority for for us now.
Stephanie speaking. Well, thank you all so much for all of your insights, for your incredible work. Really thankful to have been in conversation with you all. For everyone watching, you can create your own breakout groups if you're interested in continuing this conversation and creating your own conversation around the archive or in working within archival materials. So I encourage you to do that. And yeah, any last words? I'll leave it to you all. I won't take the last word.
Well, we're hoping that expedition content will be available for people attending this conference to view online. We haven't gotten the final yes on that from Cinema Guild yet, but hoping that if you haven't seen it, you'll be able to listen to it. You'll be able to do so on this. Thanks so much, Stephanie, for monitoring this. Thanks so much.
So this is Veronika speaking. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for Agustina and Stephanie. I think that your guys' project are really cool, and it really helps, I think about our own project in this way. So thank you so much.
It's Agustina speaking. Thanks to Veronika, Ernst, and Stephanie. I hope these conversations could be more often like this. It's very important because sometimes we are a little bit alone while doing our work, and it's good to listen to others that are thinking similar things. And I hope both Playback and Silence is a Falling Body will be there online too. I don't have the final yes also, but I hope they will.
Thank you. Bye.